Charlie, hello, how are you doing?
Hi, very well, thanks.
It's really good to have you here. This is our first video in a series we're hoping to make about wrestling. So can I ask you to start just by introducing yourself and saying a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Charlie. I perhaps more significantly wrestle under the name Josef Kafka. I'm London based, so it's mostly wrestling in London and surrounding areas, kind of Essex, a little bit on the south coast, and but all over the country, but predominantly kind of London and Essex.
Great, thank you. Just to give some context, both for you and then for our listeners as to why we're particularly interested in wrestling on this channel, I spend a lot of my time thinking about theatre and thinking about theatre before it became elite or posh or exclusive in any way, but was something that anyone might go to. And I'm really interested in any kind of popular performance, and particularly kinds of performance which get kind of downgraded or separated from other kinds of theatre, I guess. So wrestling's always interested me as a kind of performance which isn't often thought of as performance, and often it's the fact in this country at least it's often a northern or historically has often been something which is characteristic of northern England, something which is often seen of as working class, and something which is seen of as kind of not having enough text words to be theatre. I'm really interested in all of those things, how we think about performance.
It's wrestling's trash.
But it's not. I mean, it's exciting trash is the important thing. It's not trash at all. And then historically, I'm also interested in the fact that people, I mean, I work in the period when Shakespeare's active, and the theatres that Shakespeare's writing for are also combat venues in that period, something which has been kind of forgotten, I think, but they are fencing venues at a time when fencing was often extremely hands-on, all about offense and defense, attack and defend. And wrestling and other kinds of martial art are key to the period we now think of as kind of epitomizing theatre with a capital T, form of Shakespeare. So really keen to talk to you about all of those things, and particularly perhaps to think about gender. I know that's something that you're interested in, the relationship between wrestling and masculinity.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, I suppose a little bit about of my background. I did a design degree, so I suppose I'm a designer in a kind of traditional sense. But then I had a kind of practice that leaned a little bit more towards fine art. So it'd be kind of making work and projects that might make more sense in a gallery space than a shop. And I was just thinking about projects and what kind of work that I wanted to be making, and thinking about how I could move more towards performance, as that was kind of one aspect of it. And then at the other time, I was also thinking a lot about masculinity, the construction of masculinity, and the performance of masculinity, how we understand it culturally, what we deem to be favorably masculine and or kind of non-masculine, and all. I mean, it's a mess. Masculinity, it's a big, complicated network of contradictions and kind of falsehoods. So I was thinking about that and performance, and then slap bang in the middle of all of that was a kind of teenage obsession with wrestling. So I thought I would just start training, not necessarily to be a wrestler, but just to kind of immerse myself in that subculture or genre, and then almost immediately found the wrestling itself much more captivating and interesting than any kind of academic or artistic positioning or framework. So I more or less just gave up my design practice in the pursuit of professional wrestling.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in kinds of knowledge and experience and skills that come from the kind of practical work that you're talking about. And again, we tend to divide those two things off in terms of academic knowledge or practical knowledge. And I'm really interested in bringing those two together, always in conversation. So I want to jump on that last thing you said of becoming really interested in the actual act of wrestling. Again, can you tell us a bit more about what hooks you in terms of the physicality of it? I presume that's what you're talking about, the physical act of wrestling.
Yeah. And the culture of it as well. So it kind of there's like just the physicality of it, the training, and the fitness. So it kind of it occupied a kind of need I had for like fitness and health, all those kind of routines that I was kind of already interested in, but just the kind of like the physical development and practice of the body. And those exist. I think everyone has those. If you do yoga or cycling or not necessarily like a martial art, but just any kind of climbing, just any kind of physical activity, I think is the pursuit of a kind of physical practice. So just physically, it occupied me in that sense. And then there's the performative aspect of it, which is, it's probably just like a bottomless well of attention, craving, need for attention, which is great. But then because you're performing as this persona that you construct, it's a unique form of attention where it's not necessarily, the attention isn't necessarily on yourself, it's on this abstraction. So that's kind of like, I kind of think of it as like maximizing attention, but in plain sight, not having to deliver any part of your true self on stage. So you can kind of, whilst it can be quite, you're there wrestling in your pants, right, in front of strangers. So it's kind of brutal in that respect. But in some ways, I don't really think of it as myself. Anyway, so that's like the aspect of performing and getting attention. It fulfills that, and then creatively, you're trying to navigate such a complicated framework of performance. You've got to measure and pitch so many different things. So you're trying to convey like the authentic delivery of fighting. But it exists in such an obviously fake setting. I mean, to me, it all kind of looks and feels fake with costumes and characters. But you kind of got these like two aspects where you're trying to ultimately suspend people's disbelief, and make them forget that it's not real. Forget that it's but also like imbue this performance with as much pageantry as you possibly can, which ultimately like does a lot to undermine that first thing that you're trying to do. And then there's kind of other challenges about kind of like really like the design of your character, your persona, how you deliver that, how you market it, how you make that kind of, on the one hand, simple and readable enough for an audience, but also complex enough for it to be entertaining and have a kind of depth. So really, if I remember, what was the original question? As a kind of as a performance.
Performance, masculinity, and wrestling, and how those things all mix, really.
And then like the masculinity aspect of it is fascinating because so many like cultural reference points, or what we might understand to be masculine, it reinforces absolutely. So it's about like big muscles and winning fights, but then it completely undermines that because it's about like construction of image and fake tanning, making yourself look as shiny and oily as possible, and really like engage in all of those kind of like bodily practices that we associate with femininity.
Yeah, thank you. There's lots and lots to unpack there. This will seem like a random reference to lots of people, but I'd like to think that you'll like this one. But you were talking about not knowing quite whether it's you in the ring, whether it's you, Charlie, in the ring, or whether it's Kafka in the ring. And I remember Kate Bush being interviewed for her album 50 Words for Snow. I think that's 2010. And there's a song on that album about a woman having sex with a snowman. And the interviewer asked her, "Oh my goodness, did you have sex with a snowman?" And she said with great horror, "That person in the song is not me."
Yeah.
The last time I saw you wrestle, you came out to Kate Bush. Not that song. Sadly, maybe for next time we should do that.
No, I'll look it up. That's great.
Yeah, but that relationship between the real performer and the performance that they're giving is really helpful for thinking about wrestling, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And something that lots of people won't have thought about. And then you're talking about the kind of relationship between the authentic delivery of fighting, the kind of the realness and the fakeness, I guess, and talking to fight historians who are interested in the kinds of fighting I was talking about in Shakespeare's time. They're really interested in that too, because a lot of those fencing displays are fake in the terms you're using, in that you want to get up the following day and be able to do it again. So they're also kind of playing in the world, in the space between real and fake. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if real and fake are unhelpful kind of opposites, and actually it's somewhere in the middle that is where you might sit.
Yeah, they're absolutely unhelpful. I think of it in terms of calibration. But all sport and all martial art is kind of is ultimately simulated, because you're creating an architecture, right? Like a set of limitations within which you compete physically. So that might be kicking a ball through a specified size frame, or it might be wearing weighted gloves with specific amounts of padding. And so, a spoiler, I was talking about boxing, just to show my full hand. But there you've got two people punching each other, which on the one hand you might think is about as pure a form of fighting as you get. But then if you look into the finer details of that, like the specific sizing and the weighting of the gloves, that's very specific, and that's evolved to make fights last a certain amount of time. And then like more context there, within mixed martial arts, you've got smaller gloves which allow like grappling, and it changes striking, it changes how hard you can get hit, how often. And then with weight categories as well, you see completely different fighting styles. Sorry, not wanting to wander too far off piste, but that idea of fakeness and realness, you kind of have to even with things that you perceive to be as real, you kind of have to leave that at the door, because ultimately everything's kind of calibrated within a theatrical space, right? Because it's things are built in a certain way, things are elevated, and rings exist at certain sizes to make things more dramatic, and they all serve as part of this theatre.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And again, we separate sport and theatre out all the time as if they're different things, but as you're saying, they're basically exactly the same thing with very similar histories, and they're people getting together to watch stuff happen, right? Storytelling of various kinds happen.
Right.
You talked about winning fights as kind of an important part of the masculinity that wrestling explores. And I guess just because of the cruelty of mathematics, if one person is winning a fight, that means someone else is losing a fight. And like one thing that really interests me as a wrestling spectator is that relationship between matches which are all about two-way combat. In other words, where both people in a match are relatively equal, as opposed to something you see quite often with professional wrestling, where there's a dominant wrestler and a wrestler who's at the rough end of the wrestling. Could you tell us a bit more about what it's like just to be in the moment of wrestling, both in terms of the kind of physical act of grappling, but also in terms of what the kind of stories you might be trying to tell in those moments?
Yeah. Oh, it really depends, because you can construct entire matches around a kind of a reoccurring theme, which might be one guy's leg hurts, and so like the story of his bad leg, you just keep revisiting and revisiting,
Yeah.
and so you kind of, there are just like little surges of adrenaline maybe that allow that painful leg to become less painful spontaneously. um, but then ultimately, if you're just taking it in turns to lead, it's like dancing, and maybe salsa. I don't know a huge amount about dance, but where typically you'll have a lead, and the other person will be following them, and
Yeah.
then you're existing within a framework, a set number of steps. um, and not to like discredit a really good salsa, but it all exists, kind of, and a good improvised salsa is that it all exists within a framework of dance that the dancers will know. So if you know the medium, you can look at it and kind of understand it and read it, in terms of what they're doing. But if you don't know the system, then it looks incomprehensibly complicated. So within the kind of the storytelling of wrestling, is you've typically got someone is in control, someone is winning, and the other person's losing. And so you'll be taking it turns essentially to lead. And whilst there are more complicated tricks than others, generally speaking, you can break each kind of move down into like 3 different falls. You're either like doing a somersault landing on your back, you're landing flat on your back, or you're landing on your front. So as long as you can fall, or like as long as you can land safely, then there's a huge amount of stuff that you can do kind of spontaneously.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that answer the
Yeah, it does.
question?
Yeah, it's really helpful. And again, that sense of you're bringing us on something we haven't really talked about yet, which is the audience and how you kind of play to and play with the audience. So you've got the kind of the salsa thing of playing with and against your opponent, but at the same time, I mean, again, certainly someone watching wrestling, I feel like the audience are being led in lots of different ways and positioned and encouraged to be for particular people and against others, and that's kind of interesting. Again, that's very visual storytelling, right?
Yeah, I mean, within wrestling, we do it with very blunt instruments. So you'll.
Aren't they illegal?
I mean, it depends. You can. Well, sometimes not. Sometimes they are legal, but other times you can use some crafty storytelling to. The audience sees it, but the referee doesn't. Yes, but typically it's like you'll come out and berate the audience to get one reaction, or you'll come out as a fresh-faced youngster cheering and clapping. And I mean, there can be a bit more nuance to it than that, but often not a lot.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Is there anything else I should be asking you? We're heading towards the end of the interview now. Are there things that you feel the audience should know about wrestling in general, or your experience of wrestling, your training, your time in the ring?
I don't know. I think it's. I think they should trust that it's not as bad as they think it is, because I think the majority of wrestling that people have seen for the first time is kind of understandable, or like justifiably might put them off. But it's a kind of it's a coherent subculture with a methodology and a kind of with a rigor to it. And if and like any kind of art form. Oh, thanks a lot. A tea just arrived. That was my
Fantastic.
small distraction piece there. yeah, it's like it is a coherent medium, and and when it's good, it's the best. I mean, when it's good, it's as good as any other medium. And I mean, it's kind of got this this kind of like soap opera aspect to it that is a little bit kind of too much at the forefront sometimes in its kind of presentation. I might have to have another go at this question, you know, because I secretly I'm a little bit. There's some like deeply embarrassing aspects of wrestling, but I do trust that it is authentic. Can we have another go at the question?
I think we should keep going. I think this is
Oh,
brilliant.
okay.
But see how you feel. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I mean, I want both the full-on reasons why wrestling is fantastic, but also if you want to talk about it, reasons why wrestling is ridiculous. That those both seem important.
Yeah, I don't know. So the question, what was the question again? What people should know about it?
It was a really terrible question.
No, not at all.
Basically, what more would you like to say about wrestling? And you know, before you continue, I just want to second everything that you've said. And it's the most extraordinary art form. It's incredibly accessible, and it's exciting stories about, I guess, power play is what we've been talking about here, about kinds of status and power. Not always about masculinity, but sometimes about femininity and about women as much as about men. But it's a performance form which is asking you to think about power and skill and display and speed and movement and unpredictability.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you said that, and maybe I wish I said that to begin with.
You inspired me to say it. Don't worry.
Okay. No, I guess it's I'm on the one hand, I'm deeply defensive of it because I perceive it to be that kind of that beautiful thing that you just described. But then equally, I know how rubbish it can be. But I think of it in terms of like, if you like football and you can watch multiple games of football that are essentially exactly the same, you know, they last 90 minutes, there's 22 players to begin with, and then there's, you know, bits of intense drama to begin with. But even though it's not predetermined in the way that wrestling is, the theatre is identical every time, right? But it's your enthusiasm and your interest in the peculiarities and the eccentricities and the difficulties of it that draw an audience in and allow them to engage with that same story time and time again. And also like and then also that like that fandom aspect where you can support a group of strangers under a kind of trivial banner or name or title. It's exactly the same in wrestling. There's a huge amount of skill to it. The stories are by and large always the same. It's good guy versus bad guy. But then you're there engaged in two people's pursuit of wrestling, their enthusiasm and love for it and ambition to exist within it. And you can just completely lose yourself in the fandom of it. So you're following people's careers. Sometimes they're short, sometimes they're long. You know, it's a fully developed and coherent world with its own kind of systems and codes. It's all of these complicated and often contradictory things.
One of the things that I find really exciting about wrestling is the relationship between a wrestler's focus on their opponent and their focus on the audience, and it's something I see happening in all kinds of performance. So I don't know, they're currently repeating Miranda Hart's sitcom from about 10 years ago, very old-fashioned sitcom, wonderful in lots of ways, but Miranda giving an address to camera, or Kevin Spacey in House of Cards, or what have you. Or even actually in the conversation we're having now, I've had a conversation with a producer about whether you and I should be looking at each other on our TV screens or looking up at our camera. And it's that kind of, am I talking to you? Or am I talking to the audience? like wrestling's always playing in the space again in between those two options. And for me, that's
Yes.
where a lot of energy comes from. And I used to think about that in a kind of very theoretical way, but I got invited up to see Wrestling Resurgence in Nottingham a few months ago, and you feel very differently about that issue when there's a wrestler literally falling out of the ring onto your lap, which is another version of
Right.
that kind of crossing of the line.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think Resurgence definitely do that, or kind of play with that idea of repositioning it as an art form,
Yeah.
as a kind of it's like wrestling's already a kind of suspended space, because you're suspending a certain amount of things as you do when you go to the theatre, but Resurgence kind of have that additional lens where they're almost saying, this is kind of wrestling that we're producing,
Yeah.
but we're also kind of looking at it in a laboratory.
Yeah.
So come and like watch it from our laboratory rather than the comfort of a seat in a venue.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. The good thing that they're still doing is you can still go and just lose yourself in the wrestling.
Yeah.
Um,
We should give a shout out at this point to the producer Sam West and the academic who is partly behind that project, Claire Warden, who are hoping to get both of them on into this series going forwards. Yeah, Charlie, if it's all right, I wonder if we might end by, if you're able to, whether you could share some kind of anecdote or some experience that you've had in the ring which helps us think about these issues. Are there moments in the ring where you're tussling, for want of a better word, with some of these issues? Like, do you find yourself in the ring thinking the match needs to go in a particular way to tell this story? How do you communicate that to your opponent? I don't know. Are there any kind of practical moments you could share which help us think about some of the stuff we talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that that's really at the kind of the top end of the art form, and it's that kind of approach is much more kind of traditional, and kind of embedded in the world of sport era. Okay. And as a medium, it's kind of changed from a thing that was much more kind of free flowing and spontaneous and improvised, much more into choreography.
Okay.
That's more kind of it's a kind of theatrical necessity these days, where what people are trying to do choreographically is so complicated that it requires a lot more kind of planning. But there's kinds of like two approaches where you're either kind of trying to put on the best choreography that you're trying to do, or you are just going to kind of go out there and wrestle and see what is getting reactions from the audience, and dive deeper into the stuff that they're getting reactions from.
Yeah.
But that all exists in that kind of live, spontaneous dialogue with the audience, where they can kind of dictate the action almost. Happens. It kind of happens in small like little windows. So you'll have like a structure of the match in hand, and then you're just trying to like maybe like 4 or 5 notes of a match that you're trying to get to, and then within one of those little bits you'll cut something off because it's not, maybe you've already got them booing you and hating you, so you can do other stuff.
That's great.
Yeah.
I cut you off?
I hope that's all right and answers the question.
It does. That's brilliant. Thank you. I was just worried I was about to cut you off before you said something else, but no, that's wonderful. I've learned so much, Charlie. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, particularly before the tea arrived. Very impressive. We're hoping to follow this video up with some future wrestling conversations. So keep an eye out for that, people who are joining us for this conversation. But thank you very, very much, Charlie.
Great. No problem. Thanks for having me.
Take care.